Wayne, did you know that if you have a save for Symphony of the Night on your PlayStation memory card when you're playing the original Metal Gear Solid, that Psychomantis will say to you during the fight, I see you like Castlevania, don't you?
I mean, it's true. I mean, I had track and field, so I think they said something about sporting titles.
Huge invasion of privacy, isn't it? It seems quite, but it's quite creepy.
Games of Note.
Welcome to Games of Note. This is a podcast about cult games, games that matter throughout history. And we're going to talk not necessarily about if they're good or bad, but why you should care about them.
Hi, my name's Wayne, and I'm a game biz dev consultant.
My name's Will. I am a game designer. And today, Wayne, we're going to be talking about a very, very special game. And it is...
Castlevania Symphony of the Night, I hope.
Yes, you prepared correctly.
Castlevania Symphony of the Night is often considered one of the greatest games of all time. Originally launched back in 1997 for the PS1, later then had a port on the Sega Saturn, which wasn't the best of ports, which is unfortunate considering how good the Saturn is in terms of handling 2D sprites. It sold only initially 700,000 in the US and Japan. I remember actually seeing some stats though that to date it's sold up to 2 million. Across all platforms, which is, pretty good numbers. But it was a sleeper hit and is known as a cult classic, right? It has some really clever design solutions and then became the blueprint for all future Castlevania games, or what is known as Igavanias. And essentially, it was inspired, as far as I'm aware, by Super Metroid. And that's really interesting in the fact that now what we know, the type of gameplay and genre that this game has and has inspired as Metroidvania style gameplay has inspired a number of titles such as Hollow Knight and Dead Cells, Blasphemous, Axiom Verge, Guacamelee, as well as bigger AAA titles such as Dark Souls and Bloodborne as well. And what makes, I think, the game really notable is its combination of its atmosphere, and obviously the soundtrack is phenomenal. And you were saying that you own the original Japanese version of the game, right? That comes with the soundtrack.
Yeah, so that actually, when you buy, so it was originally released on PlayStation, and if you get that PlayStation Japanese version, it's a 2 CD, one of which is the CD soundtrack, and it slaps. Like, it is so good, that soundtrack. We'll get onto it a little bit later. But I think in the year I really got into Castlevania, which was like 2019, I think when I got my Spotify Wrapped, I was like 0.1% of top listeners of the sound team. And that was my most listened to album that year. I'm not really ever bothered about game music. I really love music, but game music and soundtracks not too bothered about. But this one is, particularly special. And
it's a great soundtrack.
It is very, very good. I also used it at Halloween this year as a sort of atmosphere for, put a speaker under a smoke machine outside of a house.
Setting the mood with Castlevania music. I love that.
Yeah, it was. It definitely went down well. So the thing that was interesting about this game is it's got like a long legacy of development history, and it wasn't very straightforward. So the development actually began in 1994 on the Sega 32X. Now, if you know anything about games history or games hardware, the 32X is a mess, right? It's a device that plugs into the top of the Mega Drive or the Sega Genesis, and you had to plug an extra power supply and then another lead into the back of it. And then also there were some games that used the 32X and the Mega CD, so you need 3 power supplies, and it was at a time where Sega weren't ready to move on from the Mega Drive. Because it had such an incredible install base. And so they wanted to sort of add on to it with all of these peripherals, which people didn't really want. And so 32X sort of died a death, and it very nearly put Sega under as well. But as that became evident that 32X was going to be a commercial flop, the team moved over from the game, which was at that point known as The Bloodletting. I think never officially named, but the community sort of reverse engineered that name, and there was some suggestion as well that I think there was some marketing material for it at some point.
I've seen some images that say The Bloodletting.
Right, okay. So I don't think it's completely pulled out of thin air, but yeah, the game was known as Castlevania The Bloodletting, and it was developed by Toru Hagihara, was directing the game, and he had previously worked on Castlevania Rondo of Blood, or I believe the Japanese term is for Castlevania. I'm going to try this pronunciation. I'm not as good at Japanese as you are, Wayne. Kumaju, Dracula X, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty close enough. Yeah,
okay.
Mojo.
Yeah. So, Rondo of Blood was part of the Castlevania X series. Previously, there'd been a SNES game which was called Castlevania X, and it was kind of a side series within the main Castlevania world, where it was trying out some new things. And certainly, the SNES version had lots of really cool visual effects. So, the Rondo of Blood is also considered a classic. It's a very linear, traditional Castlevania, but it is probably the very best example of that. And that came out on the PC Engine CD in Japan only. It was only ever released in Japan, at least on original hardware. And the other person that was working on the bloodletting alongside Toru Hagihara, and the name probably most associated with Symphony of Night, is a man called Koji Igarashi. And Igarashi-san was a writer and programmer initially on the bloodletting. But once the game moved over from PlayStation to 32X, something happened, which was that Hagihara was promoted to, I believe, division head. And so Igarashi got promoted up to director for Symphony of the Night. He also... I think
he was the associate director for Symphony.
He was associate director, okay,
associate
at
director,
least for this.
Yes.
And at some point, and there's a little bit of muddiness, I couldn't really work this out, there was a reworking of the concept to solve some of the problems that Castlevania had in its history. The games ended up typically in bargain bins because of the fact they were really difficult and they had low replayability. And I think Igarashi is the person that's really associated with making this change. Was they made the game non-linear and they had this kind of exploratory castle. We'll get into that a little bit more in how it plays in a minute, but it really changed how the game felt and how it played, and it solved a lot of the kind of like hard skill checks that you'd had in previous games, which made them really, really frustrating. If you go back and play Rondo of Blood or any of the kind of earlier Castlevania games, Bloodlines, or Generations as it's known in America on the Mega Drive, also fantastic. Again, a very linear Castlevania game. There are these hard skill checks and you have to just keep on playing over and over. I'm not a particularly skilled gamer, right? So those games really frustrate me. But the ability to go back, to be able to level up, to have these RPG elements, to explore and find new weapons, they made the game a lot more accessible. And they also gave this sense of exploration, which was really, really nice.
My understanding also, though, is that the game was considered a spin-off originally, so that gave them a little bit more freedom to experiment with the sub-weapons, with the exploration. And I think Igarashi is also quoted in saying that he wanted a game, to your point about the bargain bins, he wanted a game that could last for a long time. So with all of those elements and almost the freedom of knowing that this isn't going to be considered like a real mainline Castlevania, you get this amazing combination of new features and functionalities that made a game really special.
Yes. And as you say, it was part of this Dracula X sub-series, and the game actually takes off at the end of Rondo of Blood. So if you happen to own a PC Engine CD and had played Rondo of Blood, the game actually starts at the final boss, which is Richter Belmont fighting Dracula. And it also used a lot of sprites and a lot of the same enemies from that game. And so there's a feel between those two, which is, very, very similar. It was also the debut of a character artist called Ayami Kojima.
Yes.
And
the second best Kojima.
And she had a particular art style which was known as Bishonen.
Yes, if you are a fan of anime, you probably would have heard the term Bishonen, which is like young, beautiful boy or something to that extent. So essentially, the character like Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2 is considered a Bishonen character because he's like this beautiful looking male figure. The artist Ayami Kojima is, if you look at all of her previous art, is very much this almost like Renaissance looking kind of art. It's quite stunning. And I think she was also inspired by some of the art from Final Fantasy as well, and you can really tell that kind of thing.
It really is very beautiful. Like if you look at particularly the promotional art and the box art for the game, it really has like a very elegant, beautiful look to it. It's ornate, and that kind of carries through. That it walks this line of taking itself very serious but being on the borderline of kitsch, which I absolutely love.
Do you think in the 90s they considered it kitsch, or do you think that's just with our sensibilities now?
I think they probably knew it was a bit kitsch.
Okay.
I think so. So the other thing that's is unique about the game is it is 2D, but it has some 3D elements. So some of the background is 3D. When you save, there's a spinning coffin. So it uses some elements of 3D, but it probably is one of the last great commercial 2D games, right? I know there's lots of kind of indie that came after that, but it was really this hangover of 2D games, at least on consoles. A lot of that kind of went on to handheld systems, and we'll talk about the GBA and some of the legacy of Castlevania after that.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't really think of very many great 2D games that came after that, which were commercial, that weren't indie, that felt like they were part of that line.
It's a great point, because like the first thing for some reason that came into my head, and it's such an obscure reference, is Mischief Makers, the Treasure 2D game. But as you say, like, wasn't exactly a commercial success. You know, a very kind of hardcore-ish platformer. And if you're a fan of Treasure games like Radiant Silvergun and all of that, it's never top sellers. But I think you're absolutely right. I think there is something to it to say that it was probably the last high production 2D sprite-based game that was launched around that era.
Yeah, because also at this time, everybody was moving off to 3D, and certainly the Castlevania series tried, and it sort of fell that leap.
And I'm sure we'll get to it at some point in terms of the initial reviews of the game, because they're actually quite interesting if you ever kind of look back on what they were. I think famously, I think it was Games Master or something to that degree, was comparing it to the 3D titles at the time and was saying actually it doesn't look as good as those titles. But if you look at maybe some of those early 3D games, Castlevania still looks great.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. And not only does it look great, and we've already alluded to this, it sounds great. And so this is Michiru Yamane picked up the soundtrack. She also was the musician behind Bloodlines. I believe that's the correct pronouns. And it is this mix of classical, jazz, and rock. It just is so good.
It's a great soundtrack, and I'd love to know where the inspiration came from for it, because I know that there, at least from the art design, character design, that there is an inspiration from Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you can kind of see that in some of the dresses and the clothing that the characters have. But I'm always quite curious to know where this soundtrack comes from, because mixing jazz and rock is an interesting one. And although I say that, something that launched around that same time, actually 2 years prior to that, was Gundam Wing, the anime, and that does have a heavy jazz rock soundtrack. So actually, maybe that was the vibe at the time.
She also did the soundtrack behind Bloodlines, or Generations as it was known in the US, and it has this amazing sort of sound, which is a little bit like Jean-Michel Jarre's Equinox, if you've ever heard that.
No, I haven't.
It is a real epic. It really uses the soundtrack. I mean, the Mega Drive sound chip is just fantastic, that Yamaha soundtrack.
So you're saying this is better than Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Bold.
Yeah, I would say it again also slaps. Like all of Castlevania has great soundtracks, but those two are particularly good. So Wayne, let's talk a little bit about how the game plays.
Yeah, so it's a 2D platformer, and so side-scrolling, but has RPG elements to it. So I can't think of any other title prior to that was both 2D and had RPG elements. And so it did feel like it was quite unique for its time. And it had, what I always think is quite interesting about it is that you're able to equip weapons and sub-weapons, but you can have melee weapons going to each hand. So you could have maybe a short sword in the left and right hand, or you might have a long sword that would be across both hands. Then there's the sub-weapons like knives, holy waters, which I could never really use, I've got to be honest. Like I found them quite difficult. Yeah, I always found the sub-weapons quite difficult to use for some reason. It's a skill issue.
Right.
But then there's also obviously magic points. It's mana, right? In other words.
Yes.
Which is represented by hearts.
Here is the thing about playing a Castlevania game. It's hard to describe without saying it's a Castlevania game, right?
Right.
Because there are so many weird quirks to the way that the systems function. The fact that you have these sub-weapons, and to use them you press up and your attack button, and there's this real problem getting up and down stairs, which should be such a simple thing, and that still exists in all of the games. It sticks very much to the muscle memory of all of the games that you've played, dating back to the Famicom, with the addition here that there are some additional movesets. Actually quite a few, and you pick those up along the way.
Yeah. But then also it's worth remembering that there are a lot of other moves that you can do in the game from the very beginning, whether you know how to do them or not, which I think is awesome. Yes,
and a very strange thing about the fact that you begin the game playing as Richter Belmont, as all Castlevania games do at the very end of Rondo of Blood, and you've got a almost completely different moveset to the character that you play for the majority of the game, which is Alucard.
Yes.
And yeah, again, like you, it's really hard. You just need to go and play a Castlevania. If you're going to play any of them, probably play this one.
Yes.
Without giving away our ending too much. But yeah, there's the strange quirks of things like Warham or Warmeat, right? As it's known in the community, that you hit walls and sometimes they crumble and there's meat there. And the meat is the thing that gives you health rather than the hearts that you're constantly hitting and knocking out of the place.
That's right.
The other thing, there's lots and lots of systems going on in this game. It's not a light step into RPG. It's very much two-footed. Like the whole game revolves around lots of hit points and stats and coins and all of these different elements and inventory. Lots and lots of inventory. You've got these kind of like, I guess, weapons. You've also got these rings. Yeah, there's these. What do they call them? Relics, I think. Like these things that you get which give you powers, or sometimes they're passive.
Familiars as well.
Familiars, yes. Things like transmogrifications. But it does it in a way that it actually playing through it, I didn't ever really ever feel kind of overwhelmed like I might have done in some sort of classic JRPG. So I don't really know how they've done that as well as they have.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, because it's only going back to it recently that I found that a little bit overwhelming. But that's going back to like a save that I had where I'm like, 98% or whatever it is through the game. I think it does a great job of introducing you, for the most part, to a lot of the core elements of the game. It doesn't tell you a lot. And maybe that's a difference between like playing a game now and back then, whereas you used to have manuals, right? And it would kind of tell you how to play the game. The game doesn't really take you through it and tell you all of the systems that are at play. It doesn't hold your hand. And this is why I think, and we're going to come to it at some point, why I feel that there is a definite lineage between this and things like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. And
you really see it in Elden Ring, right? We'll get there. We'll talk about that, but there's a definite link. There's a definite link. And the game takes place around Dracula's castle, as all Castlevania games have done. But the difference here is that with every other Castlevania game, you start at the left of the screen and then you go to the right and then you're in a new location. The difference here was that there are multiple ins and outs and there are lots of interconnected screens, and they are represented by a map that I think if you press the select button, it brings up a map and you can see where you've been, what doors have locked, and it very much like a kind of like a Resident Evil type experience. There's that map which kind of pulls you through the game.
Yeah. And this would have been, 2 years before the first Resident Evil game? Is that correct?
I don't know what year Resident Evil came out.
Let me find out answer to that one. I think it came out 95. 96, and this is 97. Okay, so it's a year before. But then Super Metroid would have had the map, actually.
So in the very much the Metroid tradition, the spaces are gated at various points, and this is by bosses or abilities. So bosses are kind of like difficult, prolonged hits with like durable death. So if you kill a boss, the boss doesn't generally come back, and unlike the respawn enemies, and it has a reasonably punishing death loop. So it kicks you back to the beginning of the game, it makes you load from the memory card, and then it puts you back wherever you were at the time that you last saved. So very old school in that sense. And it can be quite frustrating going over and over these boss battles if you have to travel there and you might not even make it to the boss battle.
I was about to say, I was like, you must be really good if you're going to the boss battle straight away. I think this is something that's quite unique, but I can understand if anything can be quite frustrating, which is it's all risk reward. Of like, you want to progress that little step further in the castle, and you don't know if the next room is going to be a save room or if it's going to be a boss or like an enemy that's going to freeze you like the Medusa heads. Yeah, it's all of those elements.
And there are also like ability gates. So at some point there's a broken bridge, and once you get the ability to become a bat, you can, sorry, a bit of a spoiler there, you can travel over that broken bridge. There's also a lot of reasons to backtrack. So you might go to some area that you can't quite get through. It doesn't necessarily prevent your progress in the main game, but there's something there that you want. And certainly getting a almost complete exploration of the castle unlocks something quite big, which is an inversion of the castle. So at some point, once you complete the game, if you've done the right things, and there are lots of requirements to this, the castle flips upside down, and you play the game again through, a little bit like in Mario Kart when you get the reverse circuits, right?
Slightly, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think, yeah, you come across a boss, and then you have to get a combination of items or equip them to be able to see the real boss, which is like a skull or something, and that they're controlling Richter at that moment in time, and then you've got to hit that person, and then that inverses the castle, which is a spoiler, I guess, that the castle then inverses. But yes, it is then you then play through the rest of the game to then fight Dracula at the end. But interestingly, like there is a percentage in terms of going and visiting all of the space within the game. It's only when you realize, I imagine you may work it out before the inverse happens, but you go beyond 100%, right, in terms of what you can find. And I think the final percentage in terms of completion of visiting the entire castle is like 206% or something.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a high number. And I think in the later versions, where there are achievements and trophies, you are rewarded for your venturing and finding all those areas. But yeah, lots of abilities. As you mentioned, the bat, mist, it becomes really useful to be able to like get to some really tricky places. Yeah, there's lots of things to discover, and yeah, the only way you kind of discover it is through experimentation, I think, with new abilities, familiars, weapons, etc.
Wayne, do we want to talk a little bit about the story?
We can try.
Yes. So in the sort of very classic 90s Japanese game, the story is crazy. It goes off in kind of all different directions. It's hard to follow. It's cool. We're not going to go into any spoilers, not least because neither of us, I think, can really truly follow what's happening in the game. But it's set in 1797, and the game picks up, like we say, with Richter Belmont after defeating Count Dracula at the end of Rondo of Blood. And then 4 years later, Richter's disappeared and Dracula's back. And Drac's half-vampire son, Alucard. Now, if you haven't already figured this out at home, Alucard is Dracula spelled backwards.
I didn't notice this.
Did you not know?
I had no idea. I did not notice that, I've got to admit. So yeah, this is a learning for me.
Okay, and he sort of awakens himself from a self-induced slumber to investigate. And the game was... So that's all we're going to go into on the story, to be spoiler-free.
I mean, we did just spoil the fact that there is an inverse castle, but yeah, that's fine.
I think if you didn't know that there was an inverse castle, you probably would never find it.
Possibly.
I mean...
Possibly.
The game is,
fine.
Nearly
it's
30
like
years
30
old.
Years old. It's fine.
So
we're not saving anyone.
The thing that was unusual for Castlevania at this time was that the protagonist was not a Belmont. So in almost all of the other Castlevania games, you played as someone from the Belmont family who were these vampire hunters. I don't think it was the very first, from what I could understand. I think ChatGPT told me that...
Don't trust him.
Dracula Kid on the Game Boy, which I've never played, but it's
Kid
supposed to be
Dracula.
good. Kid Dracula, sorry.
Yeah, Kid Dracula. So, I mean, yes, I guess, but that is a spin-off, Kid Dracula, and that did recently get a port as part of the Requiem, I think, collection, or one of the collections of Castlevania.
It's supposed to be very good. I've never played it.
Yeah, I've never played it either, but I guess if you don't count that one, it would have all been Belmonts. And actually, I think after Symphony of Night, can't remember it being a Belmont since then. Ooh.
Yes. Yeah.
We should check that. Yeah.
It did, this marked like a huge departure, right, from Castlevania in various different ways, and I'm going to talk about that now in terms of the game design. So, I am a game designer by trade, and I really love what Castlevania did, and I didn't play the game until probably 2019, so I came really late to this game, and I mean, that's how much of a sleeper classic it really is. Much like Dracula himself, it has slept through millennia and risen, and it's got this cult status, but it does something. If you've played Castlevania games before, they're hard, they're skill gating, and it's really easy for like players just to bounce off of it, and certainly even the games that I like Bloodlines, Generations, that's happened with me. Mm-hmm. I've gotten frustrated and I've been like, I can't do this anymore. So
I had the same issue with the original titles. I think I played the original titles after playing Symphony of the Night, and I struggled to get to them, even though they are linear and therefore potentially easier in that regard. I found it quite difficult to really get into it.
And I think there is a little bit of, sometimes you get people that will brag that they prefer Rondo of Blood over Symphony of the Night because the get good type, right? I think it's almost like a little bit of a brag, like, oh, I just get through these games and I like the skill checking. The other problem that these games had is replayability, is that once you've passed through a level, maybe there's some different routes or there's some small secrets that you can find, but really you're kind of done with the game once you've got to the end of it, and there's not a lot to go back. So introducing these RPG elements, and I think Igarashi talks about two games that inspired him, one of which was Metroid, Super Metroid on the SNES, and the other was The Legend of Zelda. And this idea of exploring the landscape and being able to backtrack and being able to level up and being able to improve. So the thing that was really cool about Symphony of the Night and introducing these systems was that you can explore this castle and you feel like you've got a bit of freedom. If there is a hard skill gate, you can go and just kill some enemies and level up and go and find some new weapons and get some magic points, and you can basically improve yourself till you can go back. And that it solves so much of the game being really hard and really punishing by giving you that olive branch. If you are a really high skilled gamer, you can probably zip through it much quicker.
Well, yeah, and this is what, if you've seen any of the speed running players, which is fascinating, they are skipping a lot of the weapons and items that I think would be necessary to like complete the game. You know, they know the game in and out, and that actually just proves how, to your point, like how well made it is, and that you can tackle it however you want. If you are a highly skilled player and you can get through it and you know how, you can do so. You would have had that as a real challenge and as a blocker in the more linear original titles.
And they also will zip around backwards. So that's the fastest way to travel in the game, right?
It is the fastest, yeah, doing the kind of this, so the triangle allows you to do this slide, this really cool animated slide. I mean, everything about Alucard in terms of his animation is cool. But yeah, he does this kind of really slide dash back move, which is faster than his normal walking speed. So if you look at any speedrunners, they're just using that move throughout just to zip through the castle.
And I would say that probably that ruins the game for you, because once you know that, you start attempting to like zip through, because it is significantly faster, and then you end up, it's kind of like a fiddly way to control. So
yeah,
as soon as you go into any screen, you hit backwards and then start spamming triangle to get across. Try to resist the temptation, because as soon as you start doing that, it probably ruins the game for you, right? The game's also packed full of secrets. So, you know, there's lots of things where you can go back, and we talked about the inverted castle. You can find weapons. There's, you know, as you gain new abilities, it unlocks areas of the castle. So you're constantly wanting to like backtrack and explore. And there is a way to play this game where you just take your time and you just enjoy it, and it's atmospheric, the music's great, and all of these elements come together for it to really knows what it is, and it really feels consistent as a whole.
Agreed. Yeah, and on the secrets thing, I mean, even, it's interesting, like, even from the very beginning of the game, there are secrets, right? So your name entry, depending on what name you put in, you will get various different stats and boosts. So things like your luck can change, your attack power can change. I think if you put in Richter, you get a particular weapon. Then the other big-ish secret is that if you, as in the first section, the kind of the Rondo of Blood section, and you're playing as Richter, if you defeat Dracula without getting hit, then you get some really like high-level stats.
I think it's if you just beat him. Because you
well, yeah, I mean, there's ones if you just beat him, but then also if you don't take a hit, and then there's different stats if you don't use a sub weapon as well. Yeah, so it's like, this is all recent discovery.
There is also if you are able to, there's some sort of combination which allows you to go upstairs as well, right? In that very first boss battle, there's a secret switch, isn't there, that gives you some additional stuff.
Yeah, there's some hidden rooms. I know that there is something hidden as well.
We're nerding out on this, right?
Yeah, we are.
It kind of like speaks to the fact that this game is just packed full of bits that you can discover, and they feel like you can kind of discover them naturally somewhat, right? But it also lends itself into communities, and this is really kind of like pre-internet communities. There probably were a few people and sort of like, you know, proto game communities and forums where people would have been sharing information about this. Also, in addition, this was a really good way to sell walkthrough guides. So something that sometimes you might play a game from this era and be like, what a weird combination of things that I have to do to overcome that. And the reason they did that was because then they sold you a Prima walkthrough guide. It was kind of a little bit of a swizz at the time.
Yeah, I remember those. But also the fact that, you know, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that you used to have manuals with your games, right? And so they would give you some of those bits of information that if you come to now and you don't have a manual, you'll be like, what is this? I have no idea what this function is. And it has some elements to it that we have seen in games that are trying to mimic this era of titles. So things like Tunic, without going into spoilers, there are things you can do in that game that you wouldn't know about unless you have played through the game already, or if you've experimented by doing different button combinations and such. So yeah, there's a lot to discover in the game, and that's great. That's kind of, it feels very much from its era.
So let's talk about the legacy of the game. The key thing is that these RPG elements being added to a Castlevania game, it took sort of Metroid one step further. Metroid did some of this gating stuff. Symphony of the Night put that on steroids with all of these RPG elements. And so this spawned a genre known as Metroidvania. And if you are in the indie scene, you just cannot escape Metroidvanias. We talked about these at the top of the show. So Hollow Knight, Blasphemous, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Yuki's Island Express, Animal Well, Axiom Verge, Guacamole. Throw a stone at an indie game is probably a Metroidvania, right? There's a good chance. So this kind of like, this inspired this generation, but it also, there are a series of games which are known as Igavanias. So anything that Igarashi, is in this style that he touched, is considered sort of part of that legacy. So there are 2 games on the Game Boy Advance and there are 3 games on the DS. So Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow on the Game Boy Advance. I've played Aria of Sorrow. I've played Aria of Sorrow, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Have you played them?
I think I played a little bit of them back in the day, but I didn't own them, so I must have played it on someone's device, or I must have borrowed it. I think the problem I had, and I think they did fix it some way somehow, was the lighting on those games. I remember them being quite dark.
Well, there was a linear Castlevania on the original GBA, which Igarashi didn't have any involvement in, and that was very dark. And then Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow, they really they went a bit neon. And if you play it on an emulator now, or if you play it with a backlit screen, it feels very at odds with the tone of Castlevania generally, but just because of the nature of needing to see it. And then, as we mentioned, there were also 3 DS games, which was Dawn of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin, Order of Ecclesia, which does some novelties with sort of like the touchscreen. I've not played any of those games. I don't know if you have, Wayne.
So, yeah, I've got 1 or 2 of them. I think I've got Order of Ecclesia and maybe Portrait of Ruin. I think the one I've spent the most time in was Order of Ecclesia. And that's why I was kind of thinking about earlier that I don't think you play as any richer characters, but I have to double check that. But yeah, I have played Order of Ecclesia and a bit of Portrait of Ruin. They're good games. Very much on the same kind of Symphony of the Night style of gameplay, which is adventure, action, RPG elements. You're finding items, you're equipping them. There are various button combinations. The sprite work is quite impressive in those games as well, and they've been recently re-released and they look pretty good still. So yeah, they're solid titles.
Yes. And at the same time, while these games were being developed, Konami were really trying to make Castlevania work in 3D. And there were several 3D games that are of varying quality. Certainly the N64 one, which was the first, is poor. Some of the later ones got a little bit better. But really, at that point, the IP kind of died. Mm-hmm. Even sort of the DS and the GBA releases, they were considered kind of like small hits. Even though they had this kind of cult following, they didn't set the world alight. And Castlevania kind of died off. And with that, any talk of sort of Igarashi, until later he kickstarted Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which is basically Symphony of the Night remake to an extent for modern systems, right, Wayne?
Yeah, I've got this game. I've played it quite a bit. I didn't get too far in it, admittedly, but it is very much, it feels like a Igarashi's style Metroidvania game. The only thing, if I'm being completely honest, that I have my issue with it is that it's using this kind of 2.5D art style, and I would have much preferred for them to use kind of 2D sprite work, because I just feel like it loses something. I know that it's trying to appeal to like a more modern audience, but for me, it's definitely of the titles that are inspired by Symphony of the Night. Definitely not the N64 games or anything else from that era. But interestingly, just on the N64 title, there were 2. Did you know that there were 2?
No, I didn't know.
So there's one, I think it's just called Castlevania. And then they did another one called Castlevania Legacy of Darkness.
Okay.
But because the first game was so bad, Legacy of Darkness is basically like a fix of that N64 original. And it's like a prequel, and it kind of just is a better game. It's not a good game, but it's better than its original. So yeah, if anyone is trying to look for the N64 titles, don't go for the one just called Castlevania, go for the one called Castlevania Legacy of Darkness.
Right. I think I played the Xbox 360 one, which is maybe Lord of Shadows.
Yeah, so Lord of Shadows is an interesting set of ones. I mean, I think I remember the big thing, and really the only thing I remember about that series is that it had some quite notable voice actors. Do you remember this?
I do not, no.
Yes, I think it's had Patrick Stewart.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
Wow.
Patrick Stewart is in there. His name is escaping me, but the guy from Full Monty, the main lead.
Yeah, the name's escaped me as well.
I'm going to have to find this out now. Sorry.
He was also in Trainspotting.
Yeah, so I wasn't making it up. Robert Carlyle.
Carlisle, okay, yeah.
He's in it. Patrick Stewart's in it. The only other name I know is Natasha I don't know how you say her name, so I'm not going to say it. McElhone.
Perfect pronunciation on all the Japanese, but the Scottish, too hard.
It's Scottish.
So it also looks at, like, there's been no Castlevania games really since 2014. Other than re-releases and remakes and, PSP, there was a version of Compendium. There's Requiem, isn't there, which is now out on modern machines. There's also a way that you can play old Castlevanias, but effectively the IP is dead. But the legacy sort of lives on. And I think we've talked about this a few times. It's hard for it not to come up when you think about it because it tonally is such a similar game. It's Elden Ring.
Before we get onto this, we've said the IP is dead, but we've missed a glaring big Castlevania thing that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
The anime, or the animation, right? That started 2017, and there's been a number of series of it since then. Highly acclaimed. I watched the first season, quite enjoyed it.
Yep.
I haven't finished the rest of it, but the first season is based off the original Castlevania title, and then they do have a sequel series, which I think is Castlevania Nocturne, and that is more based around Symphony of the Night. So that would be one to kind of look at if you're interested.
It is definitely pretty brutal from my memory.
Yes,
yeah.
But it's a great show. To be clear, it's not an anime. It is a Western animation, but it does have a pretty impressive voice cast of like Richard Armitage, and he's probably the most famous person.
Right.
Bill Nighy's in it as well. There you
really?
go. He's quite famous. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. So there's a lot of big names, sort of Hollywood names now associated with the Castlevania series.
So not quite dead yet.
It's not quite dead, but if you are looking for something which is like Symphony of the Night but modern.
Mm-hmm.
If you could imagine a sort of like a parallel universe where Symphony of the Night got developed into a true 3D game, it really is Elden Ring. And it is so close tonally, and it also does lots of gameplay things which are very, very similar. It's hard, it's punishing, there are lots of systems, there are lots of secrets, there's reasons to backtrack, it's gated in by bosses or abilities. It does really feel like a modern Symphony of the Night.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think tone-wise and atmosphere, it feels closer to Bloodborne than Elden Ring. However, Bloodborne is... Yeah, I think so. Just because of the, how dark and moody it is. I think the characters feel like they're straight out of Castlevania more so than Elden Ring. However, Bloodborne is far more linear. And I would say what Castlevania is far more open, and that does seem to be more similar to Elden Ring in that regard. So I think really it's the Souls games, that entire kind of type of game is clearly inspired by Castlevania, specifically Symphony of the Night.
So I think if you are a FromSoft fan and you haven't played Symphony of the Night or any of those Igavanias, it's probably really worth going back and playing them. So it kind of leads us on to the question, and I think this has probably been foreshadowed throughout the whole thing. Should you play this game now, Wayne?
Absolutely. I think it really holds up, and there are various ways of still being able to play it. So there is a PS1 version that's available on PSN. So if you still have access to your PS4 or a Vita, you can play it there. When I first played the game relatively recently in the last, 7 years, I first played it on Vita, which is a good way of playing it. I'd say don't play it on your PS3 though, because there is a huge amount of lag when playing it. So probably not the best place. There is a port that came to the Xbox 360, and that is playable on your Series S and Series X. And then there is for PS4 and Switch, I want to say, there is the re-release of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is, I think it's part of the Requiem collection. So there are ways of playing it. Should you play it? Yes, absolutely. For all the points that you mentioned at the top, great soundtrack, looks great. I think is a quite meaty game. It's something that you can really get into. And I would agree with what you also said in that you can speed through it, but it's really worth taking your time and enjoying and savoring the level design. The castle itself is
the characters, the atmosphere.
Everything. I mean, I think the fact that they built the game to work on the inverse as well, that tells you how good the level design is. So yes, you should play it.
Definitely when you get to the inverted castle, it gets less fun and there's lots of slowdown. There are a few things that I would add to how to play it now before I talk about whether or not you should, which includes the mobile ports. So there's a mobile version which you can play with a controller as well, which is actually, I had a little play with, it's pretty good for a mobile version of the game. My conclusion is that, you should absolutely definitely play this game I didn't play it until 2019, so 6 years ago. And I came to it not really knowing the Castlevania series. It was one of the games that I just heard about year after year and people just talking about. And I was like, okay, let's give this a go. You know, I wouldn't say that even the theming of the game is something I'm particularly interested in. And I was just so surprised at how I got sucked into it. It does lots of things that are non-obvious. Like the way in which you think, okay, it's like a Dracula game and it's all going to be kind of like gothic and kind of like self-serving. It does that, but it also like constantly surprises you. None of the enemies and none of the environments are really that obvious. Like, yes, you go into a library, but what happens in that library is quite surprising to you, right? You go into a ballroom, things happen in the ballroom which are quite surprising. And it has this feel which is very much of itself, and it melds together in such a way that it almost defies any way of rationalizing that it shouldn't be as good as it is, but it really, really is. And like I say, like the modern equivalents of FromSoft games, if you like games that are a bit punishing, a bit hard, if you like games that take themselves seriously, if you like games that have got lots of systems, then you're going to really, really enjoy this.
Agreed.
Anything else?
We didn't talk about the enemy design.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the enemy design, but it sort of harks back to lots of enemies from the history of the game, including pulling some from Rondo of Blood. As well as introducing lots of new ones, and there's sort of, I believe some of the bosses are recycled as well, or reworked.
Yeah, so I've read, I didn't get to play Rondo of Blood, but there are some bosses that come back. And also, on the inverse, I think you end up replaying some of those bosses as well, in some kind of weird scenarios. But yeah, overall, fantastic game. Yeah, highly recommended.
Yep. Anything else that you want to add, Wayne, before we move on to thanks?
No, only that I kind of wish more people played it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for listening. This is our second episode. Again, we're going to leave a show notes. We're going to have an email address. If you've got feedback, if you want to tell us things that we missed, if you just want to have a moan at us, if you need someone to talk to, drop us an email and we'll be back with another episode very shortly. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.